previously. It's a nice bonus, I suppose.
Okay, well, welcome to everybody that has managed to get here. Beth, do you have control now? So if you could move on to the agenda, and I will put you in Andrew's capable hands, who will tell you what will be happening this morning. Andrew.
Okay, great. Yes, thanks, David. And yeah, and just to echo that, thanks everyone for coming along and joining us this morning. I should probably just do some quick introductions first, I think, because we have, well, we just heard from Dave. Dave Hutton's our project manager. He's employed by Herefordshire Wildlife Trust. We also have with us Beth Andrews, who is the project officer, and she works for Herefordshire and Worcestershire Earth Heritage Trust. And we also have with us Will Watson, who's the project ecologist, who's contracted to do a lot of the ecological support for this project as well. So this event this morning is kind of split into two halves. After me, we're going to have a couple of presentations. First one from Beth, talking about the geology, and then from Will, who will be covering more of the ecological side of things. And then following those presentations, we'll then have the second part, which will be very much more about questions, more informal questions and discussion. And also we've got a request for some support from yourselves in terms of the leaflet that we're producing. So just to give you a little bit of background to the project, this is a partnership between those organisations. So it's a partnership between Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, the Herefordshire and Amphibian Reptile Team, and Herefordshire and Worcestershire Earth Heritage Trust. And I mean, it's been a long time aspiration actually for Herefordshire Amphibian Reptile Team to do a project on conserving Herefordshire's ice age ponds. I think going back to sort of 2002, 2004, when they ran a project called the Herefordshire Ponds and Newts project. Will, I know you were heavily involved in that at that time. And it was through that project that it became evident that these features, these glacial ponds in Herefordshire, which have been known about for some time, we knew they existed, but they were relatively poorly understood, and it became apparent that they were particularly good from an ecological perspective. So there's been a long desire to run a project on this, but it was only until about 2.5 years ago when the partnership of organisations was successful in acquiring our first sort of tranche of money from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So we got money for what was then a development stage, which helped provide some resources for us to narrow down what we wanted to achieve through our project and provide all the detail around that. We submitted a second application, and we are now in the delivery stage of that project. And we're about 8 months into that. We've got another year and a bit to run still. So we're very grateful to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for supporting this, and obviously the lottery players as well. So if you're someone that buys lottery tickets, thank you very much, because you are directly helping conserving Herefordshire's ice age ponds. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the ponds themselves, because you are about to hear from people that know an awful lot more about them than I do. But it's just suffice to say that these are very unusual features. They're rare in a national context. They're special for a whole host of reasons, both geological and ecological, but also they're very vulnerable. We know that we have lost a lot of them, particularly in the last sort of 60 years or so, and we continue to lose them as well. So this project really is about conserving them principally, but we've got various aspects going on where we're looking into sort of the research and study of these features, as well as their conservation. And we've been doing that, and we'll be continuing to do that in a number of different ways. So we've been doing things such as surveying them. A lot of that's been through with the help of volunteers. We've been doing a lot of desk-based survey and field survey. So the desk-based survey has been particularly useful during this year of sort of lockdowns and limited ability to get out in the field. But yes, we've also been surveying a lot of these sites through the help of volunteers, but also doing some quite detailed surveys on a number of sites with the help of our ecologists. We've also been doing a lot in terms of providing information and education to the public about these. So, for example, the sorts of work that we've been doing is we've recently had a museum exhibition in partnership with Herefordshire Council. We're producing a sort of variety of leaflets and a booklet. We've produced information boards. We're going to be producing interpretation boards. There's web-based information. We're producing an app as well, which will take people on sort of a guided tour of sites, whether that be on foot or in a car or on bike, and provide information about sites. We're doing a geocache project conference, school activities and education. There's a whole plethora of engagement and education going on through this project. And alongside that, we also want to do some, actual conservation activity. So we're fortunate to have a budget to do conservation work on 15 ponds. So that's actually started, and we'll be carrying that out through this winter and next year. And looking to sort of long-term legacy management of sites as well with the help of volunteers. But essentially these ponds are spread over a very large area of Herefordshire. There are hundreds, possibly over 1,000. And the vast majority of those are effectively in private ownership on private land. Therefore, their conservation is ultimately in the hands of the many private landowners that are their custodians. So, this event today, why we've invited people here today, is because we're hoping that you can help, have a role in identifying and conserving these sites, essentially as part of your work and the activities that you carry out. And I say, finally, we've produced this draft leaflet for landowners. The idea is that it provides some simple information about the importance and value of these sites, and some simple do's and don'ts about how to look after them and to care for them. So as part of this as well, we're kind of hoping that you might be able to provide some feedback on that, make sure we're getting the language and the content about right. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I will hand over to Beth, who's up next. Beth.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Just check that I've still got control of this. Yes, it says so. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the geology of this. I work for the Earth Heritage Trust, so I'm the project officer, but I'm also a geologist. And I'm just going to give you the background of how these formed and explain a little bit about how you might be able to recognise them in the field. So around 23,000 years ago, when the most recent ice age in this area, the Devonian Ice Age, was at its maximum, the ice came into Herefordshire from Wales. It came down the valleys and spread out in a great big lobe, looking much like one of these, which is from the Canadian Arctic now. And this would have brought with it all the debris and everything the ice was carrying. And it would have spread about between Hereford and Lempston, north-south, roughly the A49. It would have reached that point and gone no further before coming backwards again. And it would have made its way kind of east, retreated back towards Wales. And the retreat starts not long after 23,000 years ago, and it's gone, and the ice age is not over, but definitely well on its way. 14,000 years ago, Herefordshire would have been ice-free. Ice completely reshapes the landscape. As it makes its way forwards, it acts like a great big bulldozer. Everything that's in its way, it's ploughing over, it's churning up. And then as it retreats, water is lazy, doesn't carry things further than it has to, and it starts depositing all that material across the landscape. So it reshapes in one direction and then reforms and overlays as it retreats backwards. Within Herefordshire, and the part that our project's interested in, the most obvious of these landscape forms is what we call Hummocky Moraine. And it's this lovely, soft, undulating, hummocky landscape. The best description I can find is if you imagine a basket of eggs with random humps and the hollows in between. This particular example, they do vary in size, but you can just about make out right in the centre of this picture a little person wearing red and some sheep in the distance. These are slightly larger than you might find further south in the area, and they do vary, as I say, but they've had several thousand years of people ploughing and driving over and reshaping and just general weathering to take the edges off them. And this Hummocky Moraine, as we call it, is the thing we're interested in. That's because the Hummocky Moraine is where we find Ice Age ponds. This map shows you the areas within northwest Herefordshire that we're keen on. The big red line you can see going from top to bottom, that's roughly where the ice got to. It's the furthest extent of that great big lobe of ice. And where you can see the stippled grey areas throughout, those are the areas that are Hummocky Moraine. These are where you find those hummocks. They're mapped by the British Geological Survey, although there's an area in the middle which is less clarified in the maps. But luckily we've got access to some fabulous data from the LiDAR, which is lasers from planes, very exciting. And that suggests that this landscape really was hummocky. And it's in these areas that we've focused our research. So how do these ponds, these Ice Age ponds, form? Throughout this project, we've mostly focused on kettle hole ponds. They're the ones that you find the major proportion of the ponds within Herefordshire are. So you start off by looking for Hummocky Moraine. Where you get Hummocky Moraine, you find these kettle hole ponds. And what happens is that great big glacier I showed you a picture of at the beginning, as it starts to retreat, bits of ice right at the front get left behind. The ice is still full of debris. So as the ice is going backwards, the debris within it is still moving forwards, a bit like a conveyor belt. And all that debris buries these blocks of ice that get left behind. The glacier will then retreat, leaving behind these big lumps. You can see in here it's labelled dead ice. It's just ice that's been left behind. It's still really cold at this point. So although our glacier's disappeared off, it's still permafrost, it's tundra. The ice will start to melt, but very slowly. As that ice melts, the space that it's left behind starts to fall in, creating a hollow. And those hollows might fill up with water and become a kettle hole pond. And the hollows develop slowly over time. Where these have been dated, not in Herefordshire, they can take thousands of years for the ice to fully melt and the full depth of the pond to be revealed. And those ponds can fill up with peat. And it's these hummocks and hollows. So the hummocks are the deposited stuff. The hollow is where you had the ice and it's now filled in with pond that we're interested in, these Ice Age ponds. One of the reasons, as a geologist especially, that we're excited about these is because where you get these kettle hole ponds, you quite often find deposits of peat. This is made up of the rotting vegetation that would have grown in and around the ponds, and it's because it's waterlogged, they don't degrade properly and they build up layer upon layer within the pond area, and they can form over thousands of years. And because it's not fully degraded, we can actually find pollen grains and plant remains. Even in one fantastic case, unfortunately, in Shropshire, they found a mammoth. I live in hope that we'll find one in the project. But what this can show us is if you actually take the peat out and have a good look, you can see a peat core here across the bottom with its stripy layers. You're able to build up a picture of the changing climate, environment, the various plants that have been found in the area, and build up that picture of environmental change since the end of the last ice age. It's quite exciting when we find these. This particular core, we found just over 2.5 meters of peat in a pond that we only found through the project. It's not marked on first edition maps. It's not marked on current Ordnance Survey maps. No one in the project had come across it because it was on private land. The landowner happened to be at a training course and said, "Oh, I've got a pond." We went and looked and were able to find this wonderful peat record showing probably about 3,000 years worth of deposition. And we were able to get some pollen grains out. We had a student look at it. So it's very exciting that these ponds can hold that whole legacy and tell us all about climate change over the last 10 or 12,000 years. So if you were out visiting a pond, or indeed someone gets in touch and says, I've got this site, how might you find them? What kind of things should set your brain going, oh, might this be Ice Age? So as Andrew said, Ice Age ponds are incredibly rare. Across the country as a whole, only about 2% of lowland ponds are considered to be natural in origin, and less than sort of half of those, about 1%, are thought to be Ice Age. So the first thing to think is that these are incredibly rare. Within Herefordshire itself, the proportion of natural ponds does seem to rise to about 25%. We are doing, Andrew mentioned, some desk-based surveys that we hope will allow us to have more confidence in the figures, but we think about 25% of the ponds seem to be natural origin and indeed Ice Age, but they're not evenly distributed. So the first thing to say is, if your pond appears in an area of Hummocky Moraine, quickest way to find this out is just to look at a geological map of the area from the British Geological Survey. Geological maps tend to employ a very consistent colour scheme. So if you can see the pale green in the centre of this pond, that pale green, on a geological map, there's also a little symbol, which is a triangle and a wiggle, then that's Hummocky Moraine, which means it's a glacial deposit, it's overlain the bedrock. That's the first thing to look for and think, maybe this pond could be Ice Age. The next thing to say is that because these ponds form as the result of a block of ice, a single piece of ice that's been left behind and then buried, the ponds themselves will be isolated features. Obviously, as they're found in land, they've been farmed, things have changed, they might now be connected to hedges and ditches and streams. But if you start to find them in the bottom of a valley floor, connected as you would expect a river to flow, you start thinking, well, maybe not. So the first thing to say is it an isolated feature? Is it a discrete pond with its own edge? So you might have them connected to other things, but they tend to look much more artificial. The best description I can give, although the more ponds you see, the more this makes sense, is when you see these ponds in the landscape, they just look like they're meant to be there. They sit properly within the landscape, they fit. And then the next one is that there's lots of other ponds nearby. These blocks of ice tended to form in huge numbers. They would break off as that glacier retreated. So in large numbers of the cases that we're looking at, you find very many of these ponds within a small area. The screen in front of you, that square, is just over 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre, and there's 17 ponds within that. And obviously, those ponds are just the ones we can still see today. This image itself is Norton Cannon in the southern part of our area. And each of these hollows that you can see in the middle represents a pond or a hollow that's now filled in. The base of this is actually LiDAR data rather than an Ordnance Survey map, because it shows up lots of features that haven't been mapped before. Throughout this project, only a couple of these had been previously known about. So the final thing to think is, I found a pond, it's in Hummocky Moraine. It doesn't appear to be artificial, it's not obviously constructed, and there's loads of other things that could be ponds nearby. And the final thing is, does it have peat? There are a couple of ways you can find this out. The first one is if you look at the British Geological Survey's maps, some, but not all by any means, ponds have peat mapped. Where you find peat, it's a brown splodge. You can see that there are 3 of these circular hollows have brown splodges in, so those have probably got peat in. The peat isn't only marked on the map. I can tell you for certain that several of these ones that are numbered also contained peat, but it hasn't been marked. Not every pond has been sampled. But if you were meeting a landowner and they said, oh, I got my digger in and it went down to the end of the scoop, or we were worried we couldn't park it in there, as several landowners have commented to us during the project, you've got a good suggestion that there's a great depth of something at the bottom, and it could well be peat. So if you find those features, it's got not a guarantee you've got an Ice Age pond. You get ponds in these areas that aren't Ice Age, but it's something that should be flagging up. Perhaps these ponds really are long-lived and could have a really interesting feature. So one of the exciting things we've been doing as part of the project is looking at how these ponds sit within the landscape. We've had access, I mentioned before, to LiDAR data. This is the same area as on the previous image. This is Norton Cannon. With the LiDAR data, what we looked at was not just the surface topography for finding the hollows, but we actually commissioned someone to map on the high points between these hollows. These ponds tend to sit by themselves. So they have, each one has its own individual little catchment. So the rain that falls might move. The catchments are very small. So within this area here is just one field with the 4 blue dots in it. Each of those dots, that's within one field. And when you're stood in the field, it's very hard to establish exactly where the boundaries form. We're able to get the LiDAR data up to kind of 10 centimetre resolution. So you can see that these are very subtle topographic features, with the bottom of the pond might only be a metre or so from the high point that separates it from the next pond. And when they're all close together, what happens very nearby can have a much bigger impact than something happening 100 metres away. So what happens in the immediate, maybe 5 or 10 metre vicinity of each pond can have a direct impact. The other thing is that as we've worked on this, we've discovered that lots of these ponds aren't currently known about. So we've been using different data sources to try and get an idea of numbers. Andrew mentioned over 1,000. One of the projects we're doing with volunteers this year has highlighted a potential 1,300 that we think were certainly on the first edition Ordnance Survey and are in the right area. We're now sending people out to see if they're still there today. So the data sources we've been looking at, the first one is, if you can see these very pale blue splodges, they're all very rounded. These are the ponds that the Ordnance Survey has mapped on their data. So that's always a good place to start for us. We then used LiDAR data and satellite images, so Bing Maps, Google Maps, that kind of thing, to see if they would highlight any ponds that hadn't shown up in the Ordnance Survey. And these are shown on here as very square, blocky looking ponds, in a kind of mid-blue colour. One of the reasons these won't show up is, and the same for the Ordnance Survey, a lot of these ponds are only around for a few months of the year, and they're very subtle topographic features. So they might only be there as wet patches over winter. So if your photograph, your satellite flyby, or your geologist or cartographer is walking along and it's the height of summer, they may not spot these features. So the final thing we've been doing is asking our volunteers to go out and look for them, asking landowners if they know of sites. And these are marked on this map with the dark blue circles. So those 4 ponds in that field, someone came to us and said, I know where there's some ponds. And we went and looked, and they do indeed appear to be Ice Age ponds and contain some peat remains. But they've never been picked up. These ponds are only about sort of 8 to 10 metres across. And several of them are definitely dry at the base during summer, so it's not immediately apparent to someone that they would be specifically ponds. You can see that in the landscape, you've got very definite ponds. A few of these showed up on the first edition and modern maps, but some of them, when taken, this is obviously kind of late summer, this particular image was taken, you can see there's several within one field. They've all got their own little area, little catchment. So what happens in the field as a whole is less relevant than what happens immediately beside. But the other thing to say is that the topography is very subtle, and the field boundaries bear no resemblance at all to the catchment areas for these ponds. So just as an aside, although I've focused on kettle hole ponds because they're by far the most common ones you'd find in Herefordshire and they are the most distinctive, there are a couple of other types of ponds that we found within Herefordshire. They're still Ice Age, but they're formed in very subtly different ways. So the most significant of these are what we call glacial lake ponds. This is because as the ice was retreating, a huge glacial lake formed not very far from Norton Cannon in the Letton area. It's a very flat, so instead of spotting those lovely rounded hummocks, you've got a very flat surface. And in this, you find these very subtle ephemeral ponds. These are a really important habitat. I know Will's going to talk about it afterwards. So that even though they only hold water for a few months of the year, they're a very significant feature. And this is actually 3 of us stood in the middle of one of those ponds. You can just about make out a slight change in vegetation between the wet bit and not. In winter, you're walking through and there's puddles, but in the summer, they're very subtle features, very hard to spot. So there are cases, just a few, and I wouldn't take it as a big thing, where not seeing the hummocks doesn't mean that they're not Ice Age ponds. Equally, not seeing water doesn't mean it's not an Ice Age pond. And the last kind are what we call subglacial hollow ponds. These, in terms of identifying them, are exactly the same as kettle hole ponds. They are in areas of Hummocky Moraine, they're discrete individual ponds, and they possibly will have peat, and they are found close together. The difference is these formed when the ice was still sat on top of them. Within ice, water is able to move up and down because of the pressure. And when it gets to the bottom of the glacier, it scours out a hollow in the ground, and then it will go back up. Maybe it hits a boulder or something contained within and goes up and down. And what this does is it creates lots of little hollows. As soon as the ice retreats, those hollows exist in the landscape, and their colonisation appears to be exactly the same as a kettle hole pond. They just have a slightly different mode of formation. And we find these round Moccas and Blakemere, which I know Will will talk about shortly. So from the point of view, the landscape looks very similar, but they did form in a very slightly different way, which is what makes Herefordshire so exciting, is that you have all these different types of Ice Age ponds, which is why we find so many wonderful features. So with that, I'm hopefully going to be able to hand over to Will now. If you've got any questions about this, because I know that was a lot of information, there'll be a chance at the end to ask me.
Right. Okay, right, I'm starting now. Herefordshire's kettle hole pond, this is how they looked 14,000 years ago. And there was a range of aquatic plants associated with these early kettle hole ponds, from bulrushes. We know we've got bulrushes, yellow water lily, marsh cinquefoil, bogbean, sedges, sphagnum. We've all found evidence of this within kettle hole ponds, and the way that we know what we've got in kettle hole ponds is that we've got peat remains. We've already mentioned about peat. Well, it's very important. It's also important because we found pollen within peat, and we've also found macrofossils. In other sites, they found macrofossils from aquatic invertebrates and other things. So there's a whole treasure trove of information that could potentially be found within kettle hole ponds. All ponds are prone to the process of succession, and that includes kettle hole ponds. When they start off, you've got open water conditions, and gradually the pond silts up, and aquatic vegetation starts to develop. But this is a very slow and long process, and you know, this happens over many thousands of years. But ultimately, as with all ponds, they end up as either sort of scrub or woodland, and they start to dry out. And that's still typical of kettle hole ponds. But you know, you might ask the question, how on earth do these sites persist for many thousands of years? 14,000 years as open water conditions. Well, there's one or two reasons, and I just want to show you the next site. This is from the Sturts. The reason you've got that reflection there is there's a load of oxygen bubbles. This is anaerobic decomposition occurring on the Sturts. So it's actually breaking down, and the silt kind of breaks down, the organic matter breaks down, and that allows it to kind of basically persist at that very shallow sort of level. You notice also that the whole profile of the site changes over time. So they might start off as sort of deep kettles, which means a sort of a deep cauldron shape, but over the millennia they fill up, and then they kind of stabilize at that level. So this is the lake bed type of kettle hole pond, and they can be extremely ephemeral, these ponds, and yet they're extremely persistent, and they remain like that for thousands and thousands of years, simply because you've got oxidization occurring. And if we look at the next slide, you can just see, here's the proof of it. There's the oxygen bubbles. Now I want to look, sorry, this is getting used to it, isn't it? Now let's look at some of the different types, the conditions of some of the kettle hole ponds that we find today. This is an example of a pond that's in excellent condition. Some of you may recognize it. It's actually the lawn pool at Moccas National Nature Reserve. What we're seeing here is emergent vegetation, and you can see all the different colors there. Well, that represents a wide range of species in that emergent zone of vegetation. In the open water, we've also got submerged vegetation, that's aquatic submerged vegetation, and floating vegetation is present there as well. The only thing that's not really quite going for this site, you'll notice in the centre of the pond, we've got grey sallow and alder, and that's kind of colonised at the site, and due to the fact that there's no grazing pressure on that area there, that's kind of formed an island. It's become dominant, and it will, over time, it is drying out the site. So yeah, there's no sites that are in natural, entirely in natural condition, but there are sites, the kettle hole sites, that show sort of semi-natural habitats. Now we'll now look at a site that's in moderate condition. And the vast majority of sites are going to be in this type of condition, because obviously they've been modified by farm and land use practices. What you'll notice here is that you've got that just universal green colour around the edge. So it's a less diverse emergent plant community, represented probably here by float grass and rushes, several types of rushes. So you may only get eight or so species around the edge, whereas the other site might contain up to 15 or even 20 species at Moccas. This site is actually at Cannon Bridge, and there's several ponds around here, and we got invited to this site. It was a site that we didn't know anything about before. You could see ponds on the map, but we approached the farmer, and lo and behold, he allowed us to come on site and to carry out surveys. But yeah, this is probably permanent pasture. It's yeah, never been ploughed, but you can see the field over the lane is arable, and obviously water quality issues come into play, and the diffused pollution and that kind of thing. So other types of ponds are slightly in worse condition, and this is one of the suite of the Kenchester pools. You'll notice the field around it is grass lay, so it's been ploughed. So you've got the immediate effect of silt and things washing into the pond. You've also got crack willow that's growing around the margin of the pond, and you can see that they're so dense there, it's going to be shading out the aquatic vegetation, so it's going to compromise that site. And then finally, if we look at this slide, this is actually a site in Shropshire, but it's also within a glaciated an ice age moraine area to the east of Shrewsbury. This particular pond, I know for a fact, it's been ploughed over many times and it's been sprayed over, and hence there is no emergent vegetation at all. There's no floating vegetation, there's no submerged aquatic vegetation, it has no vegetation at all. So therefore the range of aquatic invertebrates that are present is very minimal. So yeah, you've just got aquatic invertebrates present. So yeah, most of the ponds tend to be in the sort of middle range of condition, but there's a few also that are in that condition. And of course, those are the ones that are particularly vulnerable, because the landowner probably doesn't even see it as a pond. They don't recognise that they were formed 23,000 years ago and developed as ponds about 14,000 years ago. So, all right. Now I'm going to cover some of these sites. You'll notice that the map's quite similar to the one that Beth showed earlier. So this is obviously the Hummocky Moraine is in that sort of buff colour, okay. And these are our iconic sites, the ones that are presently known about. Some of them are very recently known about sites. Kenchester Pools we first knew about. We first got to survey in 2010 actually, and I think they would just start with this one. And yeah, there's basically what you've got here is 16 ponds within 1.5 square kilometers. So it's one of those sites where you've got an aggregation of ponds, and it's pretty close to the terminal moraine, which is located to the east at Stretton Shugwas. Of course, it then extends north-south, going up to going up to Leominster and beyond. But yeah, you've got all these ponds. Some of them are different. They're different size ponds and they're different ecologically. So we're going to use these Kenchester ponds as an example of some of the ecology that we found. The thing to point out here, this is the Withy Pool, and it's quite a different pond. It's probably not actually a typical kettle hole pond because it kind of it drains a bit to the one side. But what's interesting about this pond, it has this sort of semi-natural fringe of vegetation. The emergent vegetation here is particularly interesting. I mean, we've got yes, we've got various, we've got soft rush and we've got kingcups and we've got all the common stuff, and then the spike rush. But we've also got some of the rarer plants, for example, tufted sedge, but we've also got slender tufted sedge, and then we've got the hybrid between the two. And the hybrid is only known from 3 sites within United Kingdom. The tufted sedge itself is only confined to kettle hole sites within Herefordshire. So that just shows you how valuable and important these sites are. And then when we come down to the aquatic invertebrates, this is Agapus euglenosus, and it's only been recorded in 79 hectads out of 24,000. So yeah, it's a pretty rare beast actually. And again, we've only found these in kettle hole ponds within Herefordshire. Of course, we can't have a talk without mentioning great crested newts. The kettle hole ponds at Kenchester have got, we found them in 10 of the kettle hole sites, so that's 10 out of 16. But that's quite typical for Herefordshire. But what we're tending to find also is that the kettle hole sites, because they're such good ponds or better on average, that we tend to find more sites that have great crested newt. And we're just going to look at some of them because we did a survey recently, that's 2018. And this particular pond, which is a very interesting pond, we had 101 great crested newts around the edge. I just want to say something about this pond because it's possibly quite unique in some respects because it's an aquifer fed water body. It's not naturally fluctuating, and it's over the Yazerbrook aquifer, and it's a kettle hole pond, so that makes it particularly special. There are at least 2 other kettle hole ponds that naturally fluctuate at Kenchester, but this one seems to does it more than the others. And the one by the road we surveyed in 2018 and had I think it was 270 great crested newts. And then we looked at another couple of ponds and we had an aggregate total of 411 great crested newts, making it the best recorded site within Herefordshire for great crested newt. So yeah, that's quite an accolade, I think. And but there's other things as well we've got in these kettle hole ponds. We've got a very large common toad population that was present in one of the ponds, but common toad are not have been found in one or two of the others, but don't breed in the other ponds. So all the ponds there are quite different, which makes them, yeah, really special. This is the pond where we found the toad. So we had swarms of tadpoles going around the edge. We haven't actually done a really good toad count yet, so that's still something that we've been left to do. And then aquatic plants, we got golden dock, and that's been found, I think, 4 of the ponds there. But we've also, the last pond I just showed, which was labelled Pond 5, we had marsh dock there. And Peter Garner, who's the BSBI recorder, or was the BSBI recorder for Herefordshire, said, oh, I think that's the most westerly site in the United Kingdom for marsh dock. And I think it was the first site in VC 36. And then we got 2 rare spike rushes, of which one is slender spike rush. And they were found around the edge of 2 of the ponds. Now we'll move on to the sturts. This is Waterloo, the Waterloo Ponds, which some of you know, sometimes called Sturts East. And they're quite nice rounded kettle hole sites. The photo on the right shows what's important there is you've got floating vegetation represented by broadleaf pondweed, but you've also got submerged vegetation present. I think it's represented by crowfoots there, and also emergent vegetation. And some of that, I think I can use the point, but some of that there is tubular water dropwort. I think the next slide shows it. I haven't got the preview. Yeah, this is tubular water dropwort, which is a priority species, a pond priority species nationally. So it's also a Hereford BAP species, and again is entirely associated with the Kettle Hole Moraine in Herefordshire. This is the pond I showed earlier, this one here, and these plants here are, this is on the main, the Sturts north, and this is the pond where you used to see a lot of snipe. I hope you still do. But yeah, I remember 10-15 years ago sort of seeing 15, 20 snipe on here. And this is a slender tufted sedge, so you've got a really nice community there. Again, it's looking pretty natural community. This is one of the other shallow ponds on the Sturts. And again, we found more rare water beetles associated with these sites. This beetle is more or less confined. It's more or less confined to the Kettle Hole Moraine, but has been found outside Kettle Hole ponds, if you know what I mean. It's been found in other ponds. So we just look at the distribution, and you can see that red ring there. So it shows how isolated it is from these other sites. So this is the main bulk of its population within the United Kingdom, is the Brecklands and the sort of fens of East Anglia. And yet we've got colonies over here in Herefordshire associated with the Kettle Hole Moraine. Yeah, now we talk about Lower House Orchard, which is the other end of the Letton Lake. So we're heading east, and we're looking at this area here, and you can see these ponds here. And this is owned by Heineken, who were obviously Bulmers. And what we found here, we had a report of medicinal leech from the British Trust for Conservation volunteers who'd done a work party, and someone had one attached to them. And we came back there in 2005, and we found adult leeches. And we also, with the help of Andrew Nixon, found medicinal leech cocoon. we haven't done a detailed survey for medicinal leech yet, because it's quite a involved process, as you can imagine, splashing around in the Kettle hole ponds, probably using you know, half a dozen volunteers as well. So we haven't actually really found the medicinal leech there yet, but we may do some more surveys next year. But it's a very rare beast. It's specially protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act and is IUCN threatened. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a target we want to do for the future. Moving on to Moccas, appropriately, because medicinal leech has been found there, but has not been seen at Moccas National Nature Reserve, the Lawn Pool, or possibly the other pool, which is somewhere around here, since the year 2000. This obviously National Nature Reserve. Just a few things to point out. We have done a detailed survey here, and it'd be only right and proper that we did. So we've added to the species range within the lawn pool and the other two other glacial sites. Lawn pool is known for Bladderwort. This is obviously a very interesting plant because, you know, it feeds on water fleas, and it's always there. It doesn't always flower very well, but you can usually find it, you know, the submerged bladders and things. When you put the pond net in, you'll find it there. So yeah, it's the only site within Herefordshire for this plant. I say the only site that is native, where it's native. It has been moved around a little bit. So yeah. And then this beetle is very interesting. It's got an interesting history in terms of, you know, the study related to this beetle, Geoffrodus cinereus. It's quite a large water beetle, and it's very pretty as well. It was last found in the lawn pool in 1973, and then having been to Poland and found it, I made another special attempt to find it, and I refound it in 2016, and we found it, I think it was 2018 we found it again as well. I don't think I found it this year, but anyway, there's no reason why it shouldn't still be there, but it's the only site. So, you know, talk about vulnerability. These sites are very vulnerable, and it's isolated from other sites where it's found in the United Kingdom as well. I'll give you another example of a beetle that's isolated that we found in a minute. So just moving on, this is Blakemere. This is a site we'd never surveyed before. We'd known about it, we could see it on the map, and it looked really interesting. And when we came to look at it, yeah, we had, I think we've got up to like 60 aquatic invertebrates already. It's already right up there with Moccas, the lawn pool, and the sturts in terms of its importance. And yet we've only looked at it, well, we looked at it the year before, so we looked at it for 2 years running, and it's already right up there. It's private, well, no, it's not privately owned, it's a common, but the land around it is privately owned. So, this is one of the sites we've also done management on. Now, I just want to draw your attention to the vegetation, the trees on the right, because you can kind of see the impact here. You've got a nice emergent fringe of vegetation represented by yellow iris in the foreground, but on the right of the picture, you have crack willow, which is shading the pond, and it's causing real problems because there's no emergent vegetation under the crack willow, so it's not able to grow. So you're losing out on that valuable habitat. Yeah, this is the beetle that we found. It's Agapus undulatus, and as Professor Garth Foster said, he's the secretary of the Water Beetle Club, Balfour Brown Club. He said, it's, oh yeah, well done, Will. It's very rare to find a new rare beetle in the United Kingdom. That's basically because so many people are looking for beetles. So yeah, we found a new site for this, which is isolated from other sites within the United Kingdom. I think this one is again, yeah, I think it's nationally scarce, but it's an important species because it doesn't fly, or its flight capability, you know, is unknown. So we think, you know, it can't colonize new sites, so it's probably been there. You can imagine it being there since the last ice age and being isolated there, and all the sites in between disappearing. This is the map, and you can see that, well, there isn't a dot because this is the atlas, the recent atlas that came out in 2016, but of course we found it in 2019, so it would be around about here. And this is where all the other populations, there's basically two main centres of population in the United Kingdom, here and here, and now we've got a third. I just want to end this. This is the sort of end. Oh, threats and problems. I forgot. This is the Beige Farm, Madley, where a kettle hole site was filled in, and it took them a month. It took them a month to fill it in. It was absolutely disastrous. Subject of a prosecution, so it's an illegal landfill operation that was filled, that was operating there, that resulted in the loss of these sites. Thankfully, not too many end up like that, otherwise we wouldn't have anything left. Just want you to focus on this particular area here, because there's about, I think, 10, at least 10 kettle hole ponds here. If we show the next slide, this field has got none left. So basically, this area was, the previous slide was taken by the RAF after the Second World War, about 1949, and then this shows it how it is today. So we've lost all of those sites, and a lot of those fields there also had kettle hole ponds, and they've all gone. So this is the lake area at Letton Lakes, where there were loads and loads of ponds, and yeah, the vast majority have gone. It's only areas like the Sturts, you know, where you've got a lot of them still remaining. There are a few other fields where Church Commission land, sometimes, where you will find them. Introduction of non-native fish. It's not probably a particularly big issue, but it does occur. And where you get introduction of carp, it will have a massive effect on the aquatic invertebrate community, and things like breeding great crested newt. This is a great crested newt pond, or was, but we don't think that, well, the breeding goes right down, and you know, they have great difficulty in breeding on these sites. Ducks and geese can be a big issue. These are domesticated mallard, and actually this photo was taken at the lawn pool at Moccas National Nature Reserve, so it just goes to show that no sites are protected from the, you know, the the result of rearing of domestic, you know, pheasants and ducks and things. It can have a big issue on sites. The ducks have actually made a little rounded area here. They created this sort of you can see they've been affecting the emergent vegetation around here to create a nice pool to swim around. So yeah, they can have a big impact. And obviously Canada geese. Water quality, that's something the Freshwater Habitats Trust mention a lot, because it affects the aquatic invertebrate community greatly. If you've got good water quality, you'll have, usually you get a really rich assemblage of aquatic invertebrates. This site, which is one we've looked at this year, it's been affected by the farmer putting grain into the pond to feed the chickens. So it has its impact, but it's a lovely profile pond, and it clearly was very nice. Now, the other thing, just to finish with, trees, because that's one area that we can all have a positive impact on, is by managing the sites. Crack willows are known as an archaeophyte now, so they were introduced into the United Kingdom at some stage, and they tend to be our biggest problem around ponds, although alders are also spreading around ponds, and particularly if they get neglected, you can have a pond that was open for millennia, and then when no management takes place, what happens? All the trees start growing around the edge and they start shading it, and it starts drying out, and then we start losing sites. So, you know, we've got to find ways in which we can manage these sites, you know, by pollarding. And indeed, this is actually Blakemere, and that's obviously one of our selected sites that we have undertaken management on. So yeah, this is the future, yeah, we'd love you to support this project, and maybe they can be hopefully included within ELMS, the environmental land management scheme, so that we can find resources to help and protect other ponds. Well, I think I better end there, because I kind of notice I'm 5 minutes over, so that we can have questions and things. So I'll pass over to Dave now. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Will. That was great. Now then, stop share. So what we'd like now is, feel free to either chip in orally, or if you have some questions you want to put on the chat, do fill those in, and we can actually record those and respond to those at a later stage. I'm trying to find my copy of the leaflet. So, well, if we could start now while I'm trying to find it. Does anybody have any comments, either questions for Will or Beth, and then we'll go on to any comments you might have on the leaflet that we sent out. Either, if you want to have a chat now, either put comments in on the chat, or by all means email me later. Not a problem. I'm particularly interested in having comments on the leaflet, particularly with things like the very practical issues with farmers and landowners. Is distance of, one of the things we're not sure of is how far one should fertilise or plough, how far away one can do that without affecting, or how close one can do that to a pond without affecting the ecology of the sites. Leaflet up somewhere. It doesn't appear that we have any questions, so
sorry, I've just got some general questions, really, not
Yeah.
related so much to the because I work for the Environment Agency, so I don't have a huge amount of input with farm advice. That's a lot of the natural England. We do have some people that go out for farm advice, but sort of what I came in and wanted to know more about was some of the management. I think that's where I could sort of help at some points, if we get any funding, or if we have our operatives in the area that are doing some work, because especially as part of our works, we're getting more trying to go towards getting 20% net gain, and a lot of the time that's not possible in areas that we, you know, say in Hereford, it's not always possible to leave that, so we can look at providing that net gain on other sites. So it's just another one to have in the arsenal, really, and trying to get stuff that's going to help landscape and what's really special in Herefordshire. So that was really good to know, because I didn't really know a huge amount about ice age ponds. I was just thinking about some of the sites that are in less favourable condition. You saw that some of them, it was pretty much just you know, ryegrass around the edges. If you were to get that back into standard, how would you do that? Because of, I mean, there was some, you know, stuff like dropwort and that. It must be quite hard to get that back unless there's a site nearby that's got it. Would you sort of just try and start from, if the landowner said, right, you know, or there was a change in landowner and they said, right, we really want to improve this and make it as good as possible, would you do, I don't know, if you'd like herbicide it and then seed it from a really good, from seed collector from a really good ice age pond, or
Do you Yeah. Do you want me to come in there? Well, I think that there are projects that are operating called in Norfolk well, they do ghost pond. They have what they call ghost ponds, which are both ones that probably been filled in or scrubbed over, where they expose the seed bank, and they've had some great success. There was a very rare plant that escapes me that it was on the BBC News website. I don't know if you saw it.
Polly, something Polly?
Yeah.
It does appear that quite a lot of these ponds, if you restore them to favourable condition without actually needing to seed them, the seeds seem to survive in many cases quite well within the soil and clear them, help improve the water quality. There have been, as Will said, examples here, and I think in Germany as well, where they've done some improvement works on the outside and just left nature to it. And the seeds have gone, this suits us perfectly. And they do start to find some really interesting ones without the need to try and bring in species from either nearby or further afield, even if they have a good seed bank. It does appear that a lot of them survive a lot longer than you'd imagine.
I think, I think that's one of the most positive things we could achieve is to if there is a willing landowner, if we can identify areas where there are ghost ponds, particularly in areas of what are arable or improved grassland, and try and restore a ghost pond to its original profile, that would be, as it were, 100% improvement in terms of the biodiversity. But it obviously results in a reduction in the land area available. But if that can be compensated for by grants for the farmer, then hopefully they would see it as a positive from their point of view, as well as being net gain from an ecological point of view. But the most common circumstance is Will illustrated, ponds which have grown over and got lots of big cracked willow around them. Often they're pollarded. Just the mere carrying out of getting rid of the shading trees is a very useful thing to do, and often farmers and landowners have the kit to do that, provided they've got the necessary permissions, etc., from Forestry Commission.
Rather than I was just thinking, rather than pollarding, I'm just thinking at that site, do you ever just do full removal? I mean, it's sort of never want to say absolutely remove trees, but I guess for this habitat, it's quite important, especially when you've got crack willow. Just full removal, and then that's going to save a lot more time, I guess, fighting
certainly
it down.
Removal of trees to create permanent open areas, which means, but it needs to be proportional. There's no need to get rid of all of the trees surrounding, but if you can get rid of a proportion of them and stop them regrowing, there are obviously complications with felling licenses and that if you're not replacing them. But depending on the volume that you're taking away, then that is ideal, because as we know, if you repollard or coppice, 10 years later you're back where you were. So that would be ideal, I think.
Can I just mention a point that I'm quite curious about, because as the trees grow and the site dries out, it could obviously affect the peat or organic matter that's within the pond as it dries out. It could, starts to break down aerobically, for example, and how it affects the carbon cycle, basically, because there tends to be a reluctance from the public to remove trees. But I think we need to be looking at ponds in a more wider circle, really, in terms of their value to as intrinsic habitats, and we need to be retaining these ponds, because if we lose them, that's also going to have an impact on carbon sequestration. I don't know if anyone's looking into this. If you see what I'm trying to get at with, I still think trees that are growing in the wrong place, we still want to be in the position to manage those basically and plant trees in the right place.
I was just going to say, when it comes to establishment of species in a pond that may be, you know, bereft of because of past management, I think there's always going to be that that need to see how they respond to the management that you do in the first instance, whether you're fencing out stock or doing tree management, or, you know, reducing use of fertilizers and pesticides and so on and forth around it. Is just to see what comes in first of all, because you know, there could be stuff comes up from the seed bank, there could be colonization from nearby ponds, but then follow up, you know, if necessary. I could imagine there will be circumstances where you might want to introduce some species from nearby ponds if a site is really struggling to get re-established.
And with having, you know, the right habitat and the right places with trees, I've had a bit of a problem with that as well with basic payments and RPA, about sort of so for example, a hedgerow being in a completely wrong place. And on one farm we've had a really helpful landowner in Shropshire near the Stiper Stones that has been let us block up all of his grips, all of his drainage channels and all things like that, and he's getting paid for a hedgerow. Pretty much been told that we're not allowed to remove that hedgerow, even though it's going to be right in a bit of sort of open boggy water with shallow peat. That's what we're going for in that area. That's what the landscape sort of needs. But and it's a pretty pitiful hedgerow, to be honest. But we could move it somewhere else. But yeah, that's another complication really sometimes.
Yeah, and there's other complications around schemes and payments. I mean, we've got one on the go at the moment that we would like to restore 2 of these ghost ponds that David and Will were referring to on the Sturts, but it's an area that's in higher level stewardship, and you know, we're effectively potentially reducing the grazing area and amount of available grass, so it might not be possible within that scheme. So well, some of it will be, we think we're just sort of like passing through these, but it's another potential hoop that we have to go through to ensure that work can happen. Mm-hmm. So yes, you know, schemes I think can present the odd challenge here and there, but they can also present opportunities.
You read about Mr. Mould, did you? In East Sussex, he got prosecuted. They were going to do him for fraud, basically, because he'd created a pond on land that was in stewardship. It was on the BBC news website.
One would hope that the new Elms schemes would make this sort of thing a lot more practical, and provide less hoops to jump through, but I'm not sure how that's going to work, or if it will work in that way.
Sometimes to me it always seems almost down to the officer in the RPA, and if they go, you know, sometimes you can get a very understanding one, and indeed, you know, you can see it on a case by case, and if they go, it can be a bit tricky. So if you ever get any luck with you know, high level stewardship and changing it, and I'd be interested to know.
It's a risk and a constraint, isn't it? Yeah.
On the subject of management, just to say, from a geological point of view, because these ponds could contain peat, and that peat is a valuable resource, certainly scientifically, but also as an important habitat and, as Will has mentioned, carbon source, please don't dig out and reprofile these ponds straight away, because if the peat is dug out and dries out, it desiccates, it changes into soil. It's not the same, and reprofiling isn't necessarily the best way forward with these. It's just something to be aware of, driving heavy machinery over them. They don't look that impressive from the outside, but they're not quite the same as a normal pond. Making it deeper in the centre isn't always going to be a positive enhancement to the history of these. So it's just it's a slightly different way of thinking about them, just to bear that in mind when you're looking at them and working on them. Although if they have got meters of peat, you wouldn't want to put a big bulldozer on it anyway.
Am I right, Beth, that you probably, if you are going to do that, you probably need an expert present? So that if you're going to create a ghost pond, say through elms or something, you might need to think in terms of an expert there to supervise it, you know, probably a geologist. But
although that would be nice, I would just advise caution. Don't suddenly dig a big hole, and just because you could be damaging an important feature, because as we've mentioned, they could be many thousands of years old, which isn't something that would be intuitive if you saw a pond. So just say, if you are going to dig them, if you've got an expert that you have handy, that's great. But yeah, just go cautiously with digging holes through peat, partly because you'll lose your digger. You might find a mammoth or more than one. I live in hope. But also that once the peat's been dug through, the damage is done. It's thousands of years to replace. So yeah, just when bearing in mind management of these particular habitats, it's deeper water is not always better.
That's one point, isn't it? I think you probably mentioned it in your talk, Will, about the ephemeral nature of some of these ponds. And even though they don't always look like ponds, like the one you had, I think Beth had a picture of 4 or 5 people standing in it, there were still important species in there, which were sort of reliant on the pond being ephemeral. So that feature is also quite important.
Yes, I mean, I think that, yes, it's recognising some of these sites, because, I mean, if you're a land advisor, you know, you need to be able to recognise the, you know, when it might be a kettle hole pond. And obviously that relates back to, is it in the Kettle Hole Moraine? You know, you really need a tick list, don't you? But I think when we first started looking at the ponds on the Sturts, I think that some of the nature conservation staff there were quite amazed that some of these ponds could be, you know, 14,000 years old, and yet they were just the smallest, tiniest little hollows. I mean, literally, I suppose 20 meters square, some of them. You know, they can be very, very small. But you know, it's piecing together that information. You know, there are good examples there, and yet there's some very ephemeral sites. So yeah, they can be very ephemeral, and yet they can contain some quite important aquatic invertebrates.
Yeah. Can I just introduce Ian Fairchild, who's just joined us? He's a member of the steering group of the Ice Age Ponds project, and also formed part of the geological expertise. And I gather, Ian, you've been doing some work on water quality with colleagues. Sorry to.
Yes, thank you very much, David. Yes, I'm sorry to arrive late. There was another pre-arranged meeting that I had to attend beforehand. So the teams of volunteers supervised by Will and Beth, who've been going around doing a description of the ponds. We included some water quality work. So measurement of the pH, the conductivity, which is basically how much salt is in the water, and phosphate. We've tried nitrate, but we weren't able to get successful results with nitrate. Maybe the values are too low, but with phosphate, though, the results are interesting and a bit concerning. The median result, the middle of the set of results we've got, is about 0.5 part per million phosphate. And I've consulted a colleague at Birmingham University who has recently been appointed to a DEFRA panel about reducing nutrient inputs to watercourses. And he confirms that 0.5 part per million phosphate really is too high, and steps ought to be taken to reduce that in order to limit possible eutrophication of the water body. Now he's offered to give us some more assistance with that, but it raises an issue, and it's perhaps not unexpected that this should be the case, because the ponds we really want to look at are by definition hollows with no surface drainage out, so the water either evaporates away or it sinks into the ground. So they are certainly susceptible to pollution. And we have got information in the surveys about what the land use is immediately around the pond, and how how far away a fence might be or anything like that. So we have got that kind of qualitative information, but we haven't yet sort of looked at that to see how well that correlates with the levels of phosphate. But it's something that it kind of raises an issue, that it's really something that ideally one would like to see examined for each of the ponds. Now, we know that one local landowner, Tony Norman, has on his own initiative got a phosphate meter himself and has been doing some readings, although I don't know what results he's obtained. It's actually not that complicated to do some of these readings, and it will be although we will be able to get more data, we hope next spring and summer, to help us understand what the controls are. If any landowners wanted on their own initiative to do some work on survey, particularly doing repeat surveys to see whether the levels are changing over time, I think that will be potentially very, very valuable. And hopefully in time we will get a bit more advice from this DEFRA panel member about what will be useful to do. So as we know, generally with excess nutrients, the problem is not necessarily that that you have some particular land use, but that you just exceed a threshold where the take up of the phosphate through natural processes is exceeded. So it could be that it could be managed either by having a bigger buffer area around, or in some cases, of course, the land use itself could be detrimental, in the sense that there would then have to be a trade-off between the health of the pond and the land use. But it's useful anyway for landowners, I think, to be aware of what the issues might be on their land.
Yeah, indeed, that's useful. Thank you, Ian. So if there's anybody else got anything to add, there's probably about time to, oh, here we go. Camilla Winder has just joined us. Andrew, have you got any other thoughts on how people might be able to help with us?
No, I mean, it would be quite useful if people they go away and they have any thoughts. I mean, just in general terms, if there are tools or mechanisms, if they're thinking about the various opportunities that might be for landowners to, conserve these sites, or what should we be doing to maneuver or position ourselves in this project and the ponds themselves, so that as opportunities become available within Herefordshire through new schemes, how do we make sure that they're not forgotten and they're part of that thought process, so that they're always there, and going forward they're going to be embedded in decision making and have some potential resource to look after them. And also around the leaflet that we've circulated as well, if there's people could have a look at that, have any thoughts about as I say, whether the language is right, or there's things that need to be added, or whether there's too much jargon in it, please again feedback on that as well. So I don't think other than that there's anything else that I would suggest, but yeah, thanks to everyone for coming along really, and helping us conserving these sites in the county.
Okay, well, just thank you all very much from myself for turning up, and we will be it has been recorded. We may well put out or put a copy of it up on the website, probably edited, so if you have colleagues that would like to see it, please do point them in that direction. I'll be sending around an email with a link to that recording as well. So once again, thank you all very much for coming, and it's time to leave the presentation.